Hello and welcome to sunny Victorian England, a glorious age before plastic. Queen Vic I still sits on the throne and the British Navy triumphantly rules the waves. There's a wealth of opportunity to be had here if you know where to find it, and that extends all the way down to the riverbank. The River Thames is one of the busiest rivers in the world. Trade and goods and cargo coming in from all over the globe, trinkets being brought in from all across the world. But, as accidents will happen, sometimes some of that lovely booty is swept overboard. You see, the tidal ranges of the River Thames swell up to 23 feet, and when that happens, a rush of water runs through the channel and susses up all that lovely, valuable junk. And where there's supply, there's demand. One wouldn't want all those precious resources like coal and such to go to waste, would one? And that's where the infamous urchins, the mudlarks, came in. They were little wretches that scoured the exposed riverbed looking for any bit of tat that they might be able to sell. I know what you're thinking, eh? Mudlarking? That sounds like a lark. Ha ha! It weren't. They were considered amongst the lowest members of Victorian society, even in London, which is saying something. They were often poor, often children, often orphans even, and mostly boys who braved the hazardous conditions of the waterways to forage for all manner of practical goods. Coal, copper nails, rope, iron rivets that popped off ships, and even fat poured into the water by cooks from the vessels, and much, much more. Even before plastic, these young entrepreneurs were recycling whatever they could find for a few bob. It's a myth that recycling is a modern 21st century phenomenon, because people have been doing it for centuries. Back in Victorian England, recycling and reselling things you dug out of the riverbed could actually earn you a living, especially as goods back then weren't mass-produced to the extent they are now and were sustainable. Cooks were buying river fat, for crying out loud. But not only was the Thames one of the busiest rivers in the world, it was also one of the filthiest. Ugh. The riverbank would fester with whatever foul waste would wash up onto the shore that day. We're talking raw sewage, we're talking excrement, we're talking the bodies of cats and dogs, the lot! And even the odd human corpse, and you'd be lucky if it was just an arm or a leg. Ugh. You can only imagine the state of them. In fact, I can't do it justice, so we'll bank on the flowery waffle of Henry Mayhew in his book London Labour and the London Poor, Volume 4. That's a lot of volumes.
It cannot be said that they are clad in rags, for they are scarcely half covered by the tattered, indescribable things that serve them for clothing. Their bodies are grimed with the foul soil of the river, and their torn garments stiffened up like boards with dirt of every possible description.
No wonder then these wretches were renowned for their wince-inducing stench. In fact, after one particular interview with one wayward waif off a wharf, Henry Mayhew described how
his trousers were worn away up to his knees. He had no shirt, and his legs and feet, which were bare, were covered with chilblains, blisters caused by exposure to the extreme cold.
None of them could afford shoes, see? Bleeding hippies. And what would be the point? They'd only get stuck in the mud anyway. Gravel.
So, what did they used to dig with before plastic?
They used their hands, of course. There's nothing more nimble than a children's mitts, and there was one mudlark by the name of Peggy Jones who was able to recognise and pick coal out of the silt with her feet. If they didn't wear shoes, then at least it was a safe working environment, right? Wrong. Now, we've all trod on a bit of broken glass, but imagine running a great big shard right through your soft sole without a plaster in sight. Worse still, many a mudlark would pierce their bare feet with long rusty nails, leaving them hobbled, sometimes for weeks on end, and for some poor mudlarks, even for life. How lame. What's more, the author and journalist James Greenwood recounted just how dangerous mudlarking really was. In 1867, he told the story about an errant mudlark who ventured up a sewer. As the light faded outside, he found himself disorientated and became lodged in a sewer pipe. As the tide rose, he found himself battling against the water for hours on end. He found himself lodged, and then he started to hear tiny little squeaks. The squeaks of rats that started to nip and nibble at his tiny feet. As he hung on, trying desperately to get his head above water, until the next morning. Grim stuff. If the mudlarks were going to all this effort, you'd think it would have been a somewhat lucrative business. But no, it weren't. Their earnings were meagre. They'd be lucky if they ended up with 6 shillings a day. The poor bleeders turned to it out of desperation. That's why they often used to resort to more illicit means in order to survive. And by that, I mean pilfering anything that weren't nailed down. Here, I've got it, lads! Choose it! Choose it, I've got it!
Mayhew interviewed a 13-year-old Irish lad by the name of Martin Pryor. He disclosed that
sometimes the younger mudlarks sweep on some empty coal barge. Having been lately caught in the act of so doing, I had to undergo 7 days imprisonment in the House of Correction. This I liked much better than mudlarking. For while there, I wore a coat and shoes and stockings. And though I'd not over much to eat, I certainly was never afraid of going to bed without anything at all, as I often do when at liberty.
Prison was much tougher in my day, my backside. All things, however, must pass. And by 1936, the term mudlark had evolved to describe swimsuited London school children who used to wait by the banks of the Thames, waiting and begging passers-by and onlookers, who would then throw coins into the Thames mud, which they would then chase to the delight and the amusement of the throng. Gosh, there really was nothing to do before telly, was there? The trade, however, has been revived recently. Like everything in London nowadays, it has fallen to a new foul predatory practice, commonly referred to as gentrification. I kid you not. Wading up to one's waist in muck and excrement is now a thriving middle-class pursuit nowadays.
mudlarking is so in right now. Thames mud is anaerobic, which means there's no oxygen. So things that fell in thousands of years ago wash up in the same condition that they were dropped in many bygone eras ago. Twice a day the Thames in London swells with tidal water, and as that great daily gush tumbles through the ancient channel, it now tosses up centuries' worth of treasure. There's an argument to be made that the Thames foreshore is now the largest archaeological dig site in Britain. Notable discoveries include a 2,000-year-old Roman hairpin found on the Thames foreshore that's now on display in the Museum of London, as well as a Richard III boar badge, likely worn to the King's coronation by an attendee, now housed by the King Richard III Visitors Centre in Leicester. In fact, they're even setting up a museum based on all these finds, called the Thames Museum on the South Bank. Makes you think, doesn't it? Will they be displaying single-use shopping bags and empty 7-Up bottles in 100 years' time? I doubt it. The Port of London Authority removed 200 tonnes of plastic from the Thames last year, and other rivers aren't faring much better either. If you do want to give mudlarking a go, why not do your bit and clear some of the plastic while you're down there, for the health of the river and for the benefit of future generations. You'd have a much easier chance of finding lost treasures like hand axes from the Ice Age and dinosaur teeth if you didn't have to sift through cotton buds and takeaway containers first. The mudlarks seem to do just fine without them anyway. Whilst it was a hard life, the mudlarks could survive the cruelties of Victorian London because the things they dredged from the river weren't single use and so could be sold on. It was sustainability that saved their lives. Most goods would be reused and therefore Everything had value. Can't say the same thing about a wet wipe, can you?
I hope it fills the souls of those young Victorian mudlarks with a sense of pride and brings a certain tear to trickle down their mud-caked cheeks to know that their trade, once performed by the abject poor and fringes of society, is now performed by doctors, headmasters, bankers, priests and the like, esteemed members of the British class system, wading through the muck and the mire for precious finds, just like they did.